The rain had a way of whispering against the windows that morning, soft but relentless, like it had something to say that none of us wanted to hear. I sat near the corner of the old law office, my coat still damp, the scent of coffee and aged leather thick in the air. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, counting down to the moment I'd been dreading for months, the reading of my father's will. Charles Warren Sr. sat across the table straight-backed and polished in his tailored gray suit, every inch the man who believed control was his birthright. My stepmother Margot adjusted her pearl necklace with that same slow, deliberate motion that always meant she was preparing to enjoy someone else's humiliation. And Ethan, my younger half-brother, tapped his fingers against his watch, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth as if he already knew the outcome. Mr. Doyle, the family lawyer, cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of formality. To my son, Ethan Warren, he read, I leave the Warren Estates the yacht and full control of the Warren Foundation. Ethan smiled a flash of perfect teeth, pure entitlement. To my wife, Margot Warren, I leave all art assets under her care, including the contents of the gallery wing. She nodded approvingly, as though the entire proceeding was just confirmation of her place on the throne. Then came the pause, the moment that stretched too long. And to my daughter, Amelia Warren, Mr. Doyle hesitated, his eyes flicking toward me with something like pity. I leave the bronze sculpture known as the Phoenix's Echo. Silence. I felt my stomach tighten. That was it. No property, no shares, no inheritance, just a sculpture collecting dust in the corner of my late mother's old studio. Ethan let out a short laugh. A sculpture, he said. Guess that fits. Something beautiful, but useless. My father didn't even look at me. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and said, Some things are best left symbolic. I looked at him for a long moment, remembering how my mother's art once filled this house, how her studio door had been locked after her death. The Phoenix's Echo. It had been her last piece, a strange bronze bird she said represented rebirth through truth. My father called it foolish. I called it hope. Mr. Doyle shifted awkwardly. That concludes the will. There's a 5-day period for asset retrieval. I stood, every muscle trembling with restrained anger. I wanted to say something to ask if this was his idea of closure, but his gaze was so detached, so certain, that I was inconsequential that the words caught in my throat. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow Portland streets. I stepped into the gray drizzle, my reflection warping in the puddles at my feet. Behind me, laughter drifted from the office, Ethan's low chuckle, mixing with Margot's polished amusement. They thought it was over, that the forgotten daughter had finally been erased from the ledger. But as I walked away, the name of that sculpture echoed in my mind like a whisper I couldn't ignore. The Phoenix's Echo, my mother's last creation. Something told me it wasn't just a reminder of her, it was a message. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't worthless at all. The Warren estate stood on the edge of the Atlantic like a monument to control its stone walls streaked with decades of salt and pride. I hadn't set foot there in 10 years, not since the funeral when Margot told me to leave and not return until I learned to behave like a Warren. Yet now I was back clutching the letter from the lawyer that allowed me to retrieve my so-called inheritance. The iron gates creaked as I stepped through the wind, carrying the faint smell of the sea and the sharper scent of decay. The house looked the same, but colder, like grief had frozen over and no one had noticed. Margot greeted me in the foyer, her heels clicking against the marble, her smile thin and rehearsed. Be quick, dear, she said, voice smooth as glass. We're renovating the gallery next week. I assume you'll want to get your little bird before it ends up in storage. Her tone made little bird sound like an insult. I followed her down the hall lined with portraits of men who thought they owned the world. My father's eyes followed me from one frame to the next, and I felt the old ache rise in my chest. In the west wing, behind a half-shut door, I found the studio, my mother's studio. Dust blanketed everything, but beneath it, I could almost smell the oil paints and turpentine she once used. The light from the high windows slanted across the room, revealing the bronze sculpture standing silently on its pedestal, the Phoenix's Echo. It was smaller than I remembered, no taller than my forearm, the wings half folded as if ready to rise, but never quite daring to. I stepped closer, brushing off a thin veil of dust. My fingers traced the base of the sculpture where faint engravings hid beneath the oxidation EW 1987, pattern 7, my mother's initials the year before she died, pattern 7. I frowned. She had never done numbered series. From the corner of the room, a frail voice spoke. "She worked on that every night," said Helen Brooks, the housekeeper who had known me since I was a child. She appeared in the doorway holding a worn cloth and smiling sadly. "Your mother said it was her second voice. I thought she was losing herself talking to that piece like it could answer." "Did she ever say what it meant?" I asked. Helen shook her head. "Only that she wanted it to outlast all of them." Her eyes drifted toward the portraits on the walls, the ones of my father and his predecessors. I felt a lump form in my throat. "They're selling her things, aren't they?" Helen's expression darkened. "Your father signed the transfer last month. Everything that was hers will be listed under the foundation." I ran my palm along the sculpture again, the cool metal pulsing faintly beneath the light. I didn't know if it was memory or imagination, but it felt alive. "This is all they left me," I whispered. Helen reached out her hand, trembling. "Maybe it's all you need." Outside, thunder rolled over the sea, and for a second, lightning flashed against the bronze wings. I saw something glimmer, an intentional line, a pattern, something hidden beneath the patina. My heart skipped. Pattern 7. My mother never made art without a reason. I wrapped the sculpture in my coat and turned to leave. Behind me, the house loomed in silence, and for the first time I realized the real inheritance wasn't the art or the money, it was the secret she left behind. My apartment above the old bakery on Middle Street smelled faintly of cinnamon and varnish. The bronze sculpture sat on my kitchen table, catching the last of the afternoon light. The longer I looked at it, the less it felt like art, and the more it felt like something waiting to be solved. I poured a cup of coffee, pulled my gloves on, and began to clean the surface layer with a restorer's precision. As the grime lifted, thin grooves revealed themselves across the wings lines, too deliberate, too mechanical. My mother's work had always been expressive, but this was structured mathematical. I switched off the overhead light and turned on the ultraviolet lamp I used for restorations. Under its violet glow, the wings shimmered. Symbols began to appear, faintly etched beneath the bronze surface. Not decorative pattern sequences. Binary if my eyes weren't deceiving me. Zeros and ones arranged in spirals converging near the base. I grabbed my notebook, began copying them down, heart hammering. Pattern 7. The phrase from the pedestal echoed in my mind. It wasn't an addition number, it was an instruction. I scanned the sculpture with my phone's macro lens and enhanced the image. The spirals formed a geometric lattice, 7 repeating points. My mother had been an artist, yes, but also a mechanical engineer. She used patterns to encode motion ratios frequencies. Could this be a cipher? My laptop pinged. A new email. I frowned. No one wrote to me at this hour. The subject line read, "Stop looking." There was no sender name, only a single line in the body of the message. "You're in over your head, Amelia. Hand it over. It's dangerous." I froze. Dangerous. My mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. No one outside the family knew I had the sculpture except Margot and maybe my father. I deleted the message, but a cold ripple moved down my spine. The wind outside howled through the brick alley. I locked the door, shut the curtains, and returned to the sculpture. I couldn't stop now. The more I stared, the more the patterns began to pulse in my vision. I opened my old software for art restoration scans, converted the binary strings into ASCII code. Random letters filled the screen until I saw fragments forming truth lies within repetition. The same phrase written in my mother's notebook years ago. The connection sent a chill through me. I whispered to the sculpture, "What were you trying to tell me, Mom?" The apartment creaked. A shadow moved across the frosted glass of my front door. Slow, deliberate. My body went rigid. I turned off the lamp, heart thudding so loudly I thought whoever was outside could hear it. A pause. Then 3 soft knocks. I didn't move. Seconds stretched. Silence. Then footsteps retreating down the hall. I waited another full minute before peeking through the peephole. Empty corridor, dim yellow light. My pulse still raced. Whoever it was, they weren't random. I set the sculpture back on the table, wrapped it in an old towel. The pattern of spirals now seemed to breathe in the dark, faintly luminescent, like it wanted to be seen. I grabbed my notebook and jotted down every number, every phrase, every curve. When I finally sat back exhausted, I realized dawn was breaking. The first light hit the bronze wings, and for a fleeting moment, the grooves shimmered like a signal. Pattern 7, truth in repetition. A message buried under decades of silence. Whatever my father and Margot had done to erase her, my mother had found a way to speak beyond the grave. By late morning, the fog had rolled in from the harbor, blurring the city into soft shapes and silver light. I hadn't slept, not really. My notebook was covered in sketches, half-decoded lines, and fragments of binary strings that refused to make sense. I was stirring sugar into my coffee when a sharp knock hit the door 3 times, measured confident. My breath caught. I crossed the room, quietly peering through the peephole. A man in his 50s stood outside, gray hair, trench coat damp from rain, holding a leather folder under his arm. Not the kind of man who showed up by accident. I hesitated, then opened the door an inch. "Amelia Warren," he asked, voice low and even. "My name's Henry Callan. I was your mother's attorney before the foundation took over her estate." My grip tightened on the door. "My mother's estate was closed years ago." "Not completely," he said, and slipped a sealed envelope through the gap. "She asked me to keep this, said you'd know when to open it." I stared at the envelope. My name was written across it in my mother's looping handwriting. I hadn't seen it in decades, but I'd know it anywhere. I looked back at him. "How did you find me?" "Your brother made sure no one could," he said dryly. But I knew Eleanor better than that. She was too precise to leave loose ends. He stepped back, glancing down the hall. "You're being watched, Miss Warren. Be careful who you trust." Then he was gone, disappearing into the rain before I could ask anything else. I closed the door, locked it, and tore open the envelope. Inside were 2 things: a hand-drawn schematic labeled Warren Foundation, off-books accounts, and a single line written in her handwriting, "Truth hides in repetition." My skin prickled. The same phrase again. I spread the schematic out on the table. It wasn't a floor plan. It was an abstract diagram filled with arrows and numbers, like a hybrid between art and math. At its center was a repeating pattern of 7 nodes identical to the spiral I'd seen on the sculpture. I realized suddenly that it wasn't a code, it was a key. The sculpture wasn't just decoration. It was the cipher to unlock these accounts. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Stop decoding." I stared at it, pulse quickening. Another ping. "You don't know what you're opening." I shut the phone off. The silence afterward was deafening. Then, in the reflection of the window, I saw a figure across the street, a dark silhouette leaning against a car watching my apartment. I yanked the curtains closed, my hands trembling. My mind spun through Henry's warning. Watched. The foundation. Off-books accounts. My father's empire wasn't philanthropy, it was a shell, a network, money that didn't belong to him, money that belonged to her. I remembered being 8 years old, standing at the top of the stairs, hearing my parents argue. My mother's voice quiet but fierce. "You can't just take my work." My father's reply, sharp and final. "You'll thank me when it's worth something." I understood now. He hadn't preserved her work. He'd buried it, rewritten it under his name. Rage surged through me, hot and shaking. I looked back at the sculpture. The phoenix's echo gleamed faintly under the window light, the engraved spirals catching every flicker. I whispered, "You tried to warn me." The sound of tires screeching cut through the moment. I ran to the window, but the street was empty, only a black SUV turning the corner too fast, vanishing into the fog. My heartbeat refused to slow. I didn't know if Henry's warning had come too late, but one thing was certain: the game had already started, and I was in it whether I liked it or not. That evening, the air felt heavier than usual, the kind that presses against your ribs and reminds you to breathe carefully. I parked outside the Warren estate headlights, slicing through the mist curling around the driveway. The house loomed ahead like a sleeping beast. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them from messages or whispers through locked doors. When I entered, the familiar scent of cedar and expensive wine hit me. My father's voice came from the library, steady, commanding the same tone he used when silencing a boardroom. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said without looking up. The firelight caught the sharp lines of his face, making his age seem like another weapon rather than a weakness. Margot sat near the hearth, her legs crossed elegantly, glass of red wine in hand. "How touching," she murmured. "The prodigal daughter returns for her trinket." "It's not a trinket," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's Mom's work." "Why did she sign over everything to the foundation?" My father finally looked at me. "Because she was unstable. Her obsession with codes, numbers, delusions of grandeur. It wasn't art, it was madness. I kept the family from falling apart." My hands tightened at my sides. "You mean you kept her from exposing what you were doing?" Margot's lips curved. "You always had her temper." "It's unbecoming, Amelia." I turned to her, my composure thinning. "You erased her name from every patent filing, didn't you? You turned her work into profit. Hid it behind charity fronts." My father stood abruptly, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor echoing like thunder. "Enough! You don't know what you're talking about. I know you stole her life's work." His gaze was pure steel. "Your mother's genius was chaos. I turned it into legacy. You should be grateful." "Grateful," I repeated, my voice breaking with disbelief. "She died thinking she failed because of you." For a flicker of a second, something crossed his face, a shadow of guilt or memory, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You inherited her imagination," he said, "unfortunately, not her restraint." Margot set her glass down and rose smoothly, stepping closer. "Your father's being generous, Amelia. Take the offer." "What offer?" I asked. $3 million, my father said. "You sign over the sculpture." "No questions." "No digging." The number struck like cold air, but underneath it was something worse, fear. They weren't paying me to stay quiet. They were paying to bury something deeper. "No," I said softly. His nostrils flared. "You're making a mistake." I met his gaze squarely. "I've already made plenty." As I turned to leave, Margot's voice floated behind me, sharp as glass. "Your mother's brilliance made her paranoid. Don't let it happen to you." I didn't answer. Outside, rain lashed across the marble steps. The sea roared beyond the cliffs as if warning me to keep moving. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys. The headlights flickered to life, and that's when I saw it. A black SUV parked down the hill, engine running, no lights on. My pulse jumped. The driver's silhouette leaned forward, just enough for me to see the familiar slope of Ethan's shoulders. He raised a hand and tapped 2 fingers to his temple mock salute. Then the SUV rolled forward slowly like a predator pacing its prey. I slammed the car door engine, stuttering to life. My tires splashed through puddles as I sped away, the headlights behind me growing smaller in the mirror but never disappearing. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. They weren't just covering theft, they were hiding something far larger. And Ethan, my own brother, was part of it. The realization hurt worse than fear itself. Betrayal wasn't new in this family. It was tradition. The drive home blurred into streaks of rain and headlights, the world shrinking to the rhythm of windshield wipers and the pounding of my heart. By the time I reached my apartment, the air felt electric, like something was waiting to break. I bolted the door, set the sculpture on the kitchen table, and grabbed my tools. My father's offer, Margot's threat, Ethan's shadow, it all pointed to one thing. The Phoenix's echo wasn't a keepsake. It was a key. I studied the base again under a magnifying lens. There, almost invisible, was a thin slit too precise to be a crack. My mother never made mistakes in her work. I pried gently with a fine chisel. The sound was soft, a faint metallic click. The base separated from the body, revealing a small compartment lined with velvet. Inside lay a chip the size of my thumbnail and a folded note, edges yellowed by time. My breath caught. I unfolded the paper carefully, the handwriting instantly familiar, delicate, slanted, unmistakably hers. "My dearest Amelia, if you've found this, it means truth has survived. This code is everything they stole, every patent, every design, every account. They buried my name, but they cannot erase what you are. You were always the sharpest piece of my heart. The passkey is your birth year reversed, followed by my word for rebirth. I read it twice, then typed into the laptop, 1987, Rebirth. Nothing. I tried again, reversing the order, Rebirth 1987. The screen flickered. Then lines of text filled the monitor files, spreadsheets, transfers, schematics. Offshore accounts linked to the Warren Foundation. My father's name, Margot's, Ethan's, millions in unregistered transactions. Stolen patents bearing my mother's initials replaced by my father's signature. My stomach twisted. Every lie they'd told about her being unstable, paranoid, it was all projection. They had destroyed her to preserve themselves. I clicked through the files, tracing payments and subsidiaries, until I saw one line that made my blood run cold. Recipient Warren Foundation, Security Branch Agent E.W.W. I leaned closer. E.W. My mother's initials, but the timestamp was from 2 years after her death. I whispered, "That's not possible." The phone buzzed violently on the counter, shattering the silence. A call from an unknown number. I let it ring out. Moments later, a text appeared. "We know what you took." The lights in my apartment flickered, then died. I froze. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, replaced by the creak of the old floorboards. Someone was in the building. I moved to the window. Outside, across the street, the black SUV idled again, headlights off. My chest tightened. They knew. I grabbed the laptop, the chip, and the note, stuffing them into my bag. The sculpture went into a blanket under my arm. I stepped into the hallway, my shoes silent against the floor. As I descended the stairs, a door on the second landing opened slightly. A voice I knew too well whispered through the dark. "You shouldn't have done this, Amelia." Ethan's silhouette emerged from the shadows, his eyes glinting. "Dad was right. You don't understand what's at stake." I took a step back, pulse pounding. "You mean the empire built on stolen work? You're digging your own grave." He reached out, but I bolted down the stairs before he could move. My feet hit the street, and I ran into the fog, clutching my mother's secret against my chest. Behind me, Ethan's voice cut through the storm. "You'll regret this. Maybe." But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I finally had proof. By dawn, I was holed up at Henry Callan's small law office on the east side of town. The blinds were drawn, the air thick with the smell of old books and coffee. He took one look at my pale face, at the sculpture clutched in my arms, and locked the door behind me. "They followed you, didn't they?" he said quietly. "Ethan." I breathed. "He's in on it. They know I have the files." Henry motioned for me to sit, already booting up his computer. "Then we move fast. The longer you hold that data, the more dangerous it gets." I slid the chip across the desk. He inserted it into an encrypted drive, his eyes narrowing as lines of code flooded the screen. "Good God," he muttered. "She documented everything: patent theft, shell accounts, offshore transfers. This isn't just fraud. This is treasonous to their foundation." I stared at the scrolling data. "It's my mother's proof, isn't it?" He nodded. "Your father buried her and built an empire on her inventions." I swallowed hard. "We have to get this to the authorities." "We will?" he said, typing furiously. "I'm sending an encrypted copy to the SEC and the FBI. But once we do this, there's no undoing it. They'll come after you harder than before." I managed a bitter smile. "They already are." As he worked, the office phone rang once, then twice. He silenced it. "They'll try to silence us first," he murmured. "After that, they'll destroy what's left of her work." The storm outside broke into a steady downpour, water streaking the windows like trembling glass. Then the lights flickered. Once. Twice. The monitor blinked out. Henry froze. "They've hit the grid!" My heart leapt into my throat. A second later, the front window shattered inward shards, spraying across the desk. 2 men in black masks burst through their footsteps, heavy against the hardwood. "Find the drive," one shouted. "Dad wants it wiped before the auditors see it." Ethan's voice. He was here. I ducked behind the filing cabinet, pulse roaring in my ears. Henry grabbed the encrypted drive, shoved it into his coat pocket, and whispered, "Back door! Now!" I nodded, clutching the sculpture. The sound of drawers being yanked open echoed through the dark. Then came the sharp crack of a gun being cocked. Amelia Ethan's voice cut through the noise, steady and cold. "You can't win this. Hand it over and I can make this go away." I hesitated near the back hallway, every nerve screaming. "You murdered her work, Ethan," I shouted back. "Now you'll answer for it." I heard him curse under his breath, then the sound of boots on wood. Henry flung the rear door open and shoved me through. "Go," he hissed. "I'll stall them. I can't leave you." "Go, Amelia." His tone left no room for argument. I sprinted into the rain, the sculpture heavy in my arms, my coat plastered to my skin. Behind me, glass shattered again, a yell, then the faint wail of sirens in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. A diner sign flickered weakly in the fog. I stumbled inside, dripping water onto the tile. The waitress gave me a wary glance but said nothing. I found a corner booth, opened my laptop, and prayed the drive Henry sent had reached its targets. When I refreshed the browser, an alert appeared: transmission complete. For the first time, I exhaled. The files were in government hands now. Still, relief didn't come. I glanced out the window and froze. A black SUV idled across the street. Ethan sat inside, phone to his ear, eyes locked on me. My stomach turned to ice. The waitress's voice drifted from somewhere behind me, asking if I wanted more coffee, but it sounded far away. They weren't done. They'd never be done, not until the last trace of truth was gone. I whispered under my breath, "Not this time." Then I picked up my bag, the sculpture wrapped tightly inside, and slipped out the diner's back door into the rain. The hunt wasn't over, it was just changing hands. By the time I reached the hospital, the hallways were nearly empty, just the low hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. Helen Brooks lay pale beneath the fluorescent light, a bruise darkening her temple, her breathing shallow but steady. I gripped the rail at her bedside, my heart sinking. She had been the one person who never lied to me, who remembered the sound of my mother's laughter when everyone else had buried it. "Helen." I whispered what happened. Her eyes fluttered open, a faint, knowing smile ghosting across her lips. "Men came, asking about the sculpture," she rasped. "I tried to stop them. They knew where you'd gone, Amelia." My throat tightened. "You should have called the police. They were already inside before I could." Her fingers, cold and trembling, found mine. "Your mother always said truth is a long game. She knew it would take years, maybe longer." Her words hit like both comfort and curse. Hope was a dangerous currency in my family. It always came before the fall. I nodded, blinking back tears. "Rest now. You did enough." She managed a faint smile. "Finish what she started." Then her hand went limp. The steady beat beside her slowed, flattening into one long tone that seemed to echo through my bones. I stood there frozen until the nurse entered and gently pulled me aside. Outside, the rain had turned to mist, wrapping the parking lot in a pale shroud. I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel until my hands shook. My phone buzzed a message from Henry. "FBI confirmed receipt, but encryption incomplete. They can't open the files fully without something called Pattern 7. I stared at the words. The last piece. It had to be the sculpture. I turned on the engine, ready to drive back to his office, but before I could shift gears, headlights flared behind me. A car pulled up fast, too close. I ducked instinctively. The horn blared, once sharp, deliberate. My phone buzzed again, another message, this time from an unknown number. "The bird belongs to us." Then the car reversed, tires screeching, disappearing into the fog. My pulse thundered. They had taken the sculpture. Somehow, in the chaos at the diner or while I was at the hospital, they had found it. The last piece of my mother's code was gone. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, a raw sound tearing from my throat. For the first time, it felt like they'd won. The truth, the files, the years of her sacrifice, all of it could vanish into another cover-up. I stared at my reflection in the rain-streaked window, and for a heartbeat, I saw my mother's face instead of mine. Tired, determined, unyielding. She'd fought her entire life for something that would outlast them. I couldn't stop now. I dialed Henry, my voice steadier than I felt. "They took the sculpture. Then we get it back," he said. "The FBI needs Pattern 7 to open the core file. Without it, the case collapses." I took a breath. "Then we take it from the source." "You mean your father?" "Yes," I said. "If he still has it, it ends tonight." There was a pause on the line. Amelia going back there could kill you. I looked out at the horizon where lightning split the sky over the ocean. Maybe, I said quietly, but truth isn't meant to live in the dark. Then I hung up, started the car, and turned toward the cliffs where the Warren estate waited like a scar on the coast. If this was the end, I'd face it on my own terms. The Warren estate loomed above the cliffs like something out of another century, its windows dark, its iron gates yawning open as if waiting. The wind whipped my hair into my face as I stepped from the car, clutching the folder of copies Henry had made. Lightning flashed over the sea, throwing the stone gargoyles into stark relief. I'd spent my life running from this house. Tonight, I would end inside it. The front doors were unlocked. That detail alone told me they knew I was coming. The echo of my footsteps followed me through the marble hall until I reached the great room. My father stood by the fireplace, his back to me, flames painting his reflection in the glass behind him. Margot sat on the couch in her emerald robe, a half-empty wineglass dangling from her fingers. Ethan leaned against the piano, the bronze sculpture the phoenix's echo on the mantel beside him. Its wings caught the firelight like two blades. "You shouldn't have come back," my father said without turning. His voice was calm, even tender, like he was scolding a child. "I gave you a chance to walk away." "I didn't want your money," I said. "I wanted the truth." Margot laughed, a low, brittle sound. "The truth. Your mother was brilliant but broken." "You're just broken." I ignored her. "You killed her reputation, destroyed everything she built, and now you're going to face the people she trusted." Ethan pushed off the piano, picking up the sculpture with one hand. "You think this proves anything? It's a hunk of metal with fairy tales etched in it." He smirked. Just like her. Something in me snapped. She was worth more than this entire house of liars. My father finally turned. The years had carved him into marble, controlled, cold, deliberate. "She didn't understand power. You don't either. You think a few files and a melodramatic story can undo the Warren legacy." I took a slow step forward. "No, but the FBI might." For the first time, I saw a flicker real fear in his eyes. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I sent them everything," I said, my voice steady. "Every account, every signature, every stolen patent. They're already on their way." Margot stood, wine sloshing over her hand. "You stupid girl," she hissed. "Do you know what you've done? You've destroyed this family." "Destroyed," I said quietly. "No, I exposed it." Ethan lunged forward, fury twisting his face, but my father stopped him with a raised hand. The room fell silent except for the wind rattling the windows. "You've made a mistake you can't take back," my father said. I took another step closer, the pendant at my neck glowing faintly under my shirt. "Maybe, but I've recorded every word you've said tonight." His head jerked up. "What?" I reached into my coat and pulled the small camera pendant free, the light blinking red. "Say hello to the Bureau." The sound that escaped Margot was half gasp, half scream. Ethan dropped the sculpture onto the rug with a dull thud. My father took one step toward me, but headlights flared outside, bright, blinding. Then came the unmistakable wail of sirens rising over the storm. He froze. "Amelia," he said softly, almost pleading, "you don't understand what happens next." "I do," I said. "Justice." The doors burst open. Federal agents flooded the hall, flashlights slicing through the dark. Voices shouted commands, boots thundered across the marble. My father raised his hands, the picture of dignity undone. Margot backed away, her glass shattering on the floor. Ethan made for the side door, but two agents caught him before he reached it. As they read my father his rights, I picked up the phoenix's echo from the rug. The bronze wings were cold against my palms, heavier than I remembered. The bird seemed to stare back at me through the flickering firelight. For the first time, it looked alive. My father turned his head as they led him past. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw not fury, but something worse, recognition. "You're your mother's daughter," he said quietly. "I know," I whispered. Outside, the sirens mingled with the crash of the waves below, and for the first time in decades, the House of Warren trembled with something it had never known before, the weight of truth. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the Warren estate surrounded by pale mist and the sound of the sea gnawing at the cliffs. I stood at the end of the gravel driveway, the flash of police cameras strobing behind me, painting the house in cold white light. The empire my father built was collapsing in real time, agents cataloging evidence boxes of documents carried out, journalists waiting beyond the gate. For the first time, the Warren name drew pity instead of power. 2 hours later, I was seated inside a conference room at the Federal Building in Portland. The walls were bare, the air recycled and sterile. An FBI agent, neat suit, calm voice pushed a folder across the table. "We've confirmed the data you sent," she said. "Your mother's designs were used to siphon more than $40 million in patent royalties through shell charities. Your father and stepmother have been charged with fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction." She paused, meeting my eyes. "Your brother's pleading guilty to money laundering." I nodded slowly. It was what I expected, yet it felt surreal. Justice was never supposed to sound so procedural. "Will they serve time?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes. 25 for Charles Warren Sr., 15 for Margot, 10 for Ethan." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The numbers hit harder than I thought they would, not out of sympathy, but from the gravity of it. A family destroyed, yet finally truthful. "What happens to the foundation?" I asked. "It'll be dissolved. The board voted this morning to relinquish assets. There's one more thing." She opened another file. Inside was a printed statement from the Department of Justice. The whistleblower, known as the Phoenix Witness, provided critical evidence leading to the conviction. I blinked. "The Phoenix Witness," she smiled faintly. "Your mother named her sculpture for rebirth. Fitting, don't you think?" When I left the building, the air outside smelled like salt and wet stone. The crowd of reporters pressed forward, shouting my name, cameras flashing. I ignored them and walked straight toward the pier, the noise falling away with each step. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of being seen. A week later, I sat in the front row of the courtroom for the sentencing. My father entered wearing a Navy prison uniform, still upright, still proud, but diminished. Margot followed her once perfect poise, cracked beneath exhaustion. Ethan avoided my gaze entirely. The judge read the verdict in a voice steady as the tide, guilty on all counts. My father remained silent. When asked if he had anything to say, he turned toward me instead of the bench. "You think this will bring her back?" he asked quietly. I met his gaze. "No," I said, "but it'll stop you from burying her again." The gavel struck once. The sound echoed through the chamber like thunder. I watched them being led away, 3 figures shrinking into the machinery of the law. There was no triumph in me, only release. Afterward, Henry met me outside the courthouse. His hair was damp, his overcoat still dripping from the rain. "It's done," he said simply. "The Phoenix's echo is officially yours. The FBI cleared it for return." I took the small parcel from his hands, feeling the weight of it. The sculpture, cleaned and cold, gleamed in the gray light. "She used it to hide the truth," I murmured. "Now it's proof of it." Henry nodded. "Your mother always said art outlives corruption." I smiled faintly, though tears threatened at the corners of my eyes. She was right. The cameras were still waiting down the street, but I didn't look at them. I turned toward the sea instead, waves breaking hard against the rocks below. Somewhere in the distance, the faint cry of a gull pierced the wind, sharp and clean, and for the first time in decades, the name Warren didn't feel like a curse. It felt like an ending, and maybe the beginning of something truer. Justice had never looked like victory. It looked like silence after a storm when everything false had finally washed away. 6 months later, the house on the cliffs was no longer mine. It belonged to the state, now its doors sealed, its portrait-lined walls emptied of ghosts. I had moved to a small home along the coast where the sea sounded softer, the kind of place my mother would have painted. The days came quiet, filled with sunlight, coffee, and long walks by the dunes. The trial had ended, but the echoes of it lingered in the news, in whispers, and the look strangers gave me when they realized who I was. Yet for the first time, the name Warren didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a warning turned lesson. I stood by the window, the sculpture on the table before me. The Phoenix's echo had been returned, now cleaned and sealed in glass. Its wings gleamed gold under the morning light. Henry arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee and a thin folder. "The paperwork's final," he said. "The Warren Foundation is officially dissolved. The new one's yours." I smiled, the words still strange on my tongue. "The Phoenix Foundation," I said, testing the name aloud. He nodded, focused on restoring stolen inventions and helping creators reclaim what was taken. My chest tightened, not from grief this time, but from something close to pride. That's what she wanted, a place where truth couldn't be buried. Henry's expression softened. You turned ashes into purpose. Your mother would have liked that. I ran my fingers along the glass case. She believed rebirth wasn't about starting over, it was about building something honest from what burned. Outside, gulls wheeled above the shoreline. I opened the window, letting the salt wind sweep through the room. It's strange, I said quietly. I spent half my life trying to be invisible, and now people want to hear me speak. Henry smiled. Because you made the truth louder than their lies. He handed me an envelope, cream paper handwritten return address, Department of Justice Innovation Division. Inside was a letter acknowledging my contribution as primary whistleblower and rightful heir to the Warren patents. At the bottom, one sentence stood out in bold, all rights restored to Eleanor Warren and her estate. I pressed my thumb against her name. She finally got it back, I whispered. Henry raised his coffee cup toward me. So did you. When he left, the house was silent except for the steady rush of waves outside. I sat at my desk, opened my mother's old notebook, and began sketching again. Shapes, lines, spirals, patterns that felt like memories finding their way home. The light through the window caught the sculpture's reflection, scattering it across the wall in ripples of gold. For a second, I imagined the wings shifting almost alive, as if the bird were still learning how to fly again. I picked up my pen and wrote in the margin, "Truth endures." Then I smiled. The sea roared below, steady and endless, and I realized the echo I'd been chasing all these years wasn't my mother's voice, it was my own. A year later, the morning sun washed over the newly opened gallery in downtown Portland. Glass walls shimmered, reflecting the harbor beyond, and at the center of the main exhibit stood the bronze sculpture, the Phoenix's Echo, perched on a marble pedestal beneath a single beam of light. It no longer belonged to a family legacy of deceit. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, stolen from, or forgotten. I stood on the small stage as the crowd quieted. Reporters, students, inventors, artists, people who had followed the trial and the story watched as I adjusted the microphone. When I was younger, I thought truth was something fragile, something you had to protect. But I've learned it's the opposite. Truth doesn't shatter when you touch it, it cuts through the dark. The audience was still listening. My mother, Eleanor Warren, taught me that creation and honesty are the same act. When they tried to erase her name, she didn't fight with noise, she left behind a whisper that outlasted every lie. That whisper became this. I gestured toward the sculpture, its wings catching the light, and everything that's come after. A woman in the front row smiled through tears. I recognized her, the daughter of one of the inventors who'd received restitution from the foundation. The Phoenix Foundation had already helped dozens reclaim lost patents and rebuild careers. It wasn't just a charity. It was a mirror turned back toward the powerful. After the speech, as the crowd drifted toward the exhibits, a young intern approached me. She couldn't have been more than 20 with a notebook clutched against her chest. "Ms. Warren," she said shyly, "your story inspired me. My dad always told me women shouldn't waste time on ideas. But after I read about you, I applied to engineering school." Her words hit deeper than I expected. I smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then you've already proven him wrong." "Don't stop." When she walked away, I turned back to the sculpture. Its wings shimmered with a faint iridescence, and for a heartbeat, the engraved lines seemed to shift alive again, as if breathing with the room. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it was something else. Later, as the guests left and the lights dimmed, I stayed behind. The gallery was silent now, except for the hum of the ocean beyond the windows. I stood before the sculpture close enough to see my reflection in the bronze. "We did it, Mom," I whispered. Outside, the horizon blazed gold as the sun sank into the sea. The reflection rippled across the sculpture's wings, and I imagined my mother's voice warm, proud, unbroken. "Truth endures." I locked the doors, stepped into the fading evening, and let the wind carry that phrase into the open sky. It wasn't revenge I had inherited from her, it was clarity. And as I walked down the quiet street, the glow from the gallery window followed me like a living thing, a reminder that from ruin, something beautiful had risen and it would never be silenced again.